Well, pleasant winter's day, midwinter. Now, today I'm going to look at the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme versus Big Pharma. Unfortunately, in this country, very few people understand how many of the important social security benefits which are in place, which have been won through decades of struggle, work. And this makes it very easy for conservative and reactionary forces in society to fight against these social innovations. Now, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is a scheme which was set up by the federal government in order to ensure that all Australians could have access to most of the medications which are available around the world. Now, obviously, as the population is growing older and up to 35 to 40% of people have chronic long-term issues with their health, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, which is basically federal government subsidisation through the taxation system of pharmacy cost, is critical to our current health system. Critical. There's no point seeking medical advice, which doesn't need surgical intervention, if you don't actually have the medications to deal with that diagnosis that's been made in your case. Now, this country has a long, proud history of pharmaceuticals. In 1911, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was established, one of the early federal governments, in order to ensure that Australians had access to vaccines. Unfortunately, this innovation was privatised by the Keating-led Labor government in the early 1990s. I think at about $2.57 a share. It's now currently anywhere between $250 and $300 a share. So the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, again, is totally reliant on the private sector. The privatisation of the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory meant that we no longer had a mechanism in this country via which to develop medications and produce medications. So we become totally reliant on the private sector. And the pharmaceutical industry worldwide, like most industries on this planet, have now been corporatised. So it's almost impossible for small groups to negotiate with big pharmaceutical corporations. It's very difficult. So the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is basically a mechanism where experts who've made a decision to incorporate certain medications into the subsidised scheme can then use part of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme to initiate dialogue with big pharmacy, with pharmaceutical manufacturing companies regarding costs to the federal government, that's you and me, the taxpayer, regarding certain medications. Now, obviously, this isn't a static scheme, it's a scheme where more and more medications are added to the list. But ultimately, the only way we can access these medications as a country is through the private sector. Now, research in this country has a proud history which has basically been trashed over the last 20 to 30 years. Research and health initiatives surrounding medications are now almost totally dominated by the private sector, to such an extent that universities are now dependent on the private pharmaceutical industry for investment in order to carry out research, and obviously this has strings attached to it. And those strings are very simple, that if the negative results appear in the research, they're not published. That's part of the contract with many of these pharmaceutical corporations. Obviously, positive results are published. At the same time, a private pharmaceutical corporation has what's called a patent. If a new medicine is developed, a new pharmaceutical is developed, that corporation has a patent on that medication for up to 25 years in the majority of cases. That means nobody else except under license can produce that medication, which gives them a great deal of bargaining power, as we saw with the AIDS epidemic and the manufacture of medications which are able to keep the worst symptoms of AIDS at bay. Now, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, as I said before, is an instrument that not only provides medications at cheap prices to Australians. I think currently it's $6 to $7 if you're on a social security benefits, and not more than $35 if you're not on a social security benefit. That's only for medications which are listed under the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. So the government then has to go, or the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme executive has to enter negotiations with private pharmaceutical corporations regarding the cost of that medication to the government. Now, obviously, if you and I were negotiating with a pharmaceutical company, there is no way we would get any discounts because we have no bargaining power. But a sovereign nation state does have bargaining power, and obviously it's a debate about what the cost will be. Obviously, the more people that need a particular medication, the greater the bargaining power the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is able to use in order to decrease prices to the government, to the consumer, and ultimately to the consumer, because the subsidisation cost is reduced. And if the subsidisation cost is reduced, what that means is that that savings can be used to add new medications to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, which are subsidised by the taxpayer. So you've got this constant interaction between big pharmaceutical companies which want to make a profit, who have patents on new medications, who are happy to negotiate and drive a hard bargain with the federal government through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. For example, if you are eligible for COVID medications and you're diagnosed with COVID and you fall within the criteria which are set by the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, if you're on a social security benefit, you don't pay more than $7. And if you are a wage earner, you don't pay more than $35. But the cost to the government, and that's you and me, the taxpayer, is $1,028 per bottle. And there's about 40 tablets in a bottle. That's $1,028. Now, obviously, most Australians who have COVID, who fall within the pharmaceutical benefits criteria, don't have that money for one course. So having a pharmaceutical benefits scheme which subsidises medications through the taxation system is a win-win situation for everyone. Now, obviously, big pharmaceutical corporations want to maximise their profits, and obviously negotiations can be quite heated. But Australia has one of the best records in the world. The Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is one of the best records in the world in terms of forcing corporations, pharmaceutical corporations that want to sell medications to this country, to deliver them at a lower price than most other places in the world. Now, I think a lot of Australians don't really understand that in most sovereign nation states there is no such thing as a pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and that if you can't afford the medication, well, you die. It's very simple. If you can't afford the medication, well, you don't receive it. And obviously, big pharmaceutical companies which have a patent on medications for up to 25 years will use their ability to monopolise the marketplace with that particular medication to increase their profits. Now, unfortunately, what is a significantly good scheme is now coming under increasing pressure. And it's coming under increasing pressure from what is considered to be Australia's main ally, the United States of America. Now, the Trump administration has the Australian Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme in its sights. It would love to destroy the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme because that would increase profitability for United States-based pharmaceutical corporations. And it has begun to put pressure on big pharmaceutical companies that are based in the United States who provide much needed essential medications to legislation which will only pay big pharmaceutical corporations based in the United States the lowest price which they receive overseas, because they consider the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme to be some type of tariff because the government and the Australian people are collectively bargaining for access to important medications. Currently, we are in the midst of a vicious battle in order to ensure the Pharmaceutical Benefits Corporation continues to function. And over the last few weeks, we have seen big pharmaceutical companies withdrawing life-saving drugs which have been used for the Australian population for things like breast cancer and Parkinson's disease, to put pressure on the federal government through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme to increase prices so their prices in the United States of America are increased. This is nothing short of blackmail. This is nothing short of murder. To use people with chronic disabilities and carcinoma as pawns in a game to satisfy the Trump administration's desire to destroy the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme because of its success in terms of putting a lid on prices that can be charged by big pharmacy. Now, we have found ourselves in this situation for one very good reason. Because there is no competition in the pharmaceutical sector in this country. There is no government-owned Commonwealth Serum Laboratory. There are no government-owned manufacturing facilities to manufacture medications. There is minimal investment and research and development in the health sector in the universities of this country. And we now find Big Pharmaceutical is one of the main donors to the university sector regarding health initiatives. And obviously this money is not given willy-nilly, it's given with many strings attached. So this is an exceptionally important time in this country's history. One of the most successful and egalitarian and important social security innovations that's been created through the blood, sweat and tears of generations of Australians and Australian taxpayers is now coming under attack by so-called allies. Think about it. Under sustained attack. And some of the most vulnerable people in our society are those that are being used as pawns in this attempt to dismantle the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. Now, I haven't heard anything from Divided Nation or the Liberal Party or the National Party of any substance talking about how important the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is. All I hear is about the cost to the community. Well, obviously, the cost of providing subsidised medications to people with chronic disabilities and even acute medical issues is much cheaper than the cost to the community as a whole in allowing people to use scarce health facilities to help them with their problems. Now, this is not just a problem in this country, it's a problem around the world. We've seen big pharmaceutical companies deny medications to hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who need these medications to survive. We have seen big pharmaceutical companies use their market dominance to fund research which only will increase their profitability. For example, most research which is carried out today by the private pharmaceutical industry is about research which creates medications which can be used for long-term problems like hypertension, diabetes, cholesterol, heart disease, and the list goes on and on. Very little private money from these pharmaceutical corporations goes into developing treatments which cure diseases in a few weeks, or where the return is minimal, like malaria, where over 8 million people die every year still of malaria around the continent. No wonder the Gates Foundation is the primary donor to malaria research, because the private pharmaceutical corporations have no interest in placing money in this research. And obviously I don't blame them, because they have one thing in common. They need to maximise profits to their major shareholders. That is the nature of the current pharmaceutical system. And unless governments set up competitive forces in their own sovereign entities to counter this domination by privately owned pharmaceutical corporations, we will continue to face the same blackmail and the same issues year in and year out. It's one thing to bend to their demands to increase return through negotiations through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. It's another more radical approach to adequately fund university research publicly, that the public enjoys the benefits, not the private sector, and to set up alternative drug research institutions which are funded by the federal government and set up manufacturing centres which manufacture these medications. So think about it. Every time you walk into a pharmacy and hand over a script, the cost of that script, the majority of that script, is subsidised by the federal government. That's why you have access to that medication, irrespective of your position in society, irrespective of whether you can afford it or not afford it in the private marketplace. That's why it's critical that you contact the Federal Health Minister and the Cabinet Ministers and demand that the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme is not stripped of its authority by Big Pharma, big pharmaceutical companies which are blackmailing this government at the expense of the health and life of so many people in this country.